like to start from Pasuk Hey in Kedoshim. Hashem, if you will bring a peace offering to Hashem, you should bring it with a willingness, with all the right intent, meaning the thought process should be a proper thought process. So Rashi explains over here, when the Yisrael, even a non-Kohen, is qualified to do the shchita on a korban, on a shlamim, on any korban, and when he slaughters it, he has to have a proper intent. What happens when he slaughters it? He has in mind, whether it's the Kohen, the non-Kohen, that it will be eaten in its proper time, is valid. But what happens if he has in mind to eat not in its proper time? The slaughtering is done correctly, but when he slaughters it, a shlamim could only be eaten for 2 nights and a day. The day it's slaughtered, the following night, and the following day. He has in mind it's going to be eaten beyond that time period. That's the thought process. And then the Kohen takes over, completes the service. What is the status of that animal? Everything was done correctly, except the thought at the time of the slaughter was to eat it not at its proper time, or to sprinkle the blood not in its proper time. We'll see in a moment, it's pigul. The korban is invalidated, and if you eat that korban, the liability is koris. That's the prohibition of pigul. Pigul means it's been putrefied, because he had that intent to either to eat it not in its proper time, or to do the service not in its even if, in fact, he ate in its proper time afterwards, or the blood was sprinkled in its proper time. But because he had this inappropriate thought when he did the slaughtering, to be sprinkled not in its proper time, to be eaten at its proper time, it assumes the status of pigul. So he explains, if the pasuk here is only come tell me the parameters in which you're permitted to eat it, we had earlier, Torah tells us what the time period when you're permitted to eat the shlamim. When you initially do the slaughtering, te almanas nachsruach shei lachem rotzon, shem tachshu olav machsheves psul, or pigul in the brackets, lo yirotza lechem lefanai. The korban will not be acceptable to me. Okay? Pasuk Vav. B'yom zivchachem yi'ochel limochros. The korban could only be eaten on the day that it's slaughtered. It's a shlamim. And the next day, as I said, it's 2 days and a night. V'anosar ad yom hashlishi. And what's left over on the 3rd day, beishi sorif, it should be burnt in the fire. B'yom zivchachem yi'ochel, Rashi, kishtizbechu tishchetu al mnas lochlo bezman zer shekvatu lechem kvar. The intent has to be when you slaughter the animal, it should be eaten in the time period which I set. And if it should be eaten on the 3rd day, we'll see what this pigul hu lo yirotze. It's pigul. The animal, the korban, is classified as pigul, something which is putrefied. It is not accepted. So you take a look, Rashi. What does the word pigul mean? Metuav. Metuav means it's abominated. V'ochlav avona yisa. And the one who eats of that korban, he will carry this in. He has kodesh Hashem chila, because he desecrated what was initially consecrated. V'nichrasa nefshi me'amel. And the one who eats it, the liability is koris, spiritual excision. He's cut off from his people. Take a look at Rashi. 1 second. So over here, yeah, Alan, you wanted to ask something.
Yeah, two-part question. One, there are four parts to the offering,
The service, to the service.
to the service. All four parts have to be perfect. At what point does the chorus start to play a role?
No, so let me explain it. Let's say he has this improper thought. He does the shechita, that the animal will be eaten on its proper time, or the blood will be sprinkled not at its proper time. He has to finish the whole service. Let's say at that point he just stops, doesn't sprinkle the blood. If the carbon then is eaten, it's a Torah prohibition, but it doesn't carry the liability of koris. It's only if he carried through, and even if the other components of the service were done correctly, even with the proper thought. He only had this improper thought at the time of the shechita. Now he receives the blood, and it will be sprinkled in its proper time. The animal will be eaten in its proper time, but he carries through the sprinkling of blood. That animal is classified as pigul. It's abominated. If he eats that korban, it has the liability of koris. But if he stops at that point and doesn't go beyond that point, the korban, because he didn't sprinkle blood, is not valid. But if he eats it, it doesn't carry the liability of koris. It's only if it's pigul. Pigul means that all the various components of the service had to be completed. And during one of the components, he had the improper thought to be sprinkled not in its proper time, to be sacrificed not in its proper time, or to be eaten not in its proper time.
Does the person who brings the shlomim, does he eat also?
Shlomim, the majority of the shlom is eaten by the one who brings it. Right. The Kohen gets a certain portion, and the innards, which are the fats, that's sacrificed on the mizbeach.
Right. So how does the person who's bringing the korban, how does he know that the Kohen had an improper?
He doesn't. Thought? Well, there's an argument in his
vote. Why does he get koresh?
Good question. Let's say the Kohen himself. First, there's a question: when he has this improper thought, does he have to verbalize it? Let's say he just thinks it. He doesn't articulate it. So, according to Machlokes Rashi Tosas Zvachim, whether it even invalidates it. It may not invalidate it. The thought, unless it's expressed, it doesn't invalidate the korban. So if that's the case, it's not a problem. So we're speaking where the Kohen had expressed this improper intent, and people heard it. So now the korban is classified as pigul. So we know it's something which it's not valid. Now the question if somebody eats it, what's the liability? The liability is koris. And if you say that even if he has the thought, the Kohen himself, let's say he would eat it himself. It's a personal thing. And now he receives his portion, chazav v'shok, the breast or the thigh of the animal. That's given to the Kohen of the shlomim, and he eats it. So he knows he had the proper thought. He has a problem. He ate something which carries the liability of koris. Okay, that's what it's speaking. Now over here, there's a famous Orach Chaim HaKodesh. If you eat non-kosher, nevela, meaning it wasn't ritually slaughtered properly, a non-kosher species, what's the liability? Malchus. But yet, the korban, that all the components were done correctly, only because he had this improper thought, which invalidates it, it carries this extreme level of what? Of koris. The question why? That's what the Orach Chaim over here comes to explain. And when he explains something here, it's something similar to what he says in regard to the level of contamination of the dead of a Jew versus a non-Jew. A Jew contaminates even if you don't come in direct contact with the remains. If you're in the same room with the remains of a Jew, under the same roof, you become contaminated. It's the equivalent of coming in contact with the remains. If you have a non-Jew in that same room, if you don't come in contact with the remains, you don't become contaminated. Only direct contact. Meaning the contamination of the Jew is more intense, and it gives a greater level of impurity than the non-Jew. The question is why. So Orach Chaim HaKodesh in Parshas Chukas explains this, and he says a similar concept over here regarding the korban that's been invalidated with this improper thought. Why it carries such an extreme level of prohibition, which if you eat a non-kosher species or a kosher species which wasn't slaughtered at all, which is nevela, it's only malchus. It doesn't carry the liability of kares. That's what he goes to explain over here, and he explains v'nichrosa nefesh.
What pasuk, Rabbi?
Pasuk ches. Yesh lo says tam loma yechomer onish kohen ochel kochim chutz lizmanam chiyuv kares. Why does it have such an extreme level of liability? The kohen eats the kochim, which was chutz lizmanom, yosem ochel nevelu trefu shkotzim, that if you would eat an animal that wasn't ritually slaughtered, or it was found to have a blemish, an internal defect, or shkotzim, something which are rodents, which are all Torah provisions, but the liability is not as extreme. Why? So he says, da. Ki min ha'tam atzmo she'omru. He says it's the same concept as the Gemara says in Yevomis, Yisrael metami ba'oel, vein aku metam ba'oel. The remains of a non-Jew in an oel, under a roof, it contaminates anything which is within that, under that covering, roof covering. A non-Jew's remains, it does not contaminate. Why? L'tzat Yisrael heim bechinas hakedusha. The Jewish people are classified within the classification of kedusha. Lezeh, therefore, keshemistalekes mena kedusha. So when the kedusha leaves that entity, meaning when the soul departs, as we said, Reb Chaim Volozhin cites this, that the greatest angel cannot fathom the makeup of the Jewish soul. That's how different the Jewish soul is from the non-Jewish soul. And the reason why that is because it's explained based on the Zohar that the Jewish soul, its location from where it was created was mitachs kisei hakavod, from under the heavenly throne, whatever that means. Everything else that was created, including the angels, was from a lower level. So the angel cannot fathom or understand anything which its source is from a higher level. So because the soul comes from that more advanced level, therefore even the greatest angel is not able to fathom, to understand its makeup, which is not the case with a non-Jewish soul. So as a result of that, the dimension of Kedusha, of Nishmas Yisrael, is a different level of Kedusha. As a result of that, what happens when that neshama now departs from the body? The body itself is the receptacle for that neshama. The example we always give, you have a perfume bottle, and you have intense quality perfume, which gives an unbelievable fragrance. You empty the bottle. Even though the bottle's empty, there's a residue of that fragrance in the bottle. And you know exactly what's in the bottle. The body being the receptacle for the neshama, even after the soul leaves the body, there are traces of that kedusha which remain in that body. The non-Jew having a lesser dimension neshama, the traces of kedusha are much less. So he goes to explain now. All the nether forces, when the soul departs, gather and come upon that body. Since something that's consecrated is a level of kedusha, there's nothing more advanced than that entity. So when that expiration moment comes, time comes, the kedusha leaves that entity. As result of that, the nether forces attach themselves to that location which that advanced level of kedusha was. So when you ingest this piece of meat now, which is now absorbed with all these most advanced level nether forces, it actually destroys the soul. It limits and damages the soul and causes a separation between the neshama and God, which is not the case by eating other forbidden items, such as non-ritually slaughtered meat, because they never had the kedusha, or the animal that has the defect in one of its 18 locations, or the rodents. That tumah, because it doesn't have that intensity of negativity in impurity, it doesn't damage the soul. Umistaheres bemalkus, And how do you purify it? When the person receives Malkos, he's reinstated, and that corrects the defect or the damage that was done to the neshama. This is the Orach Chaim HaKodesh. Over there, he explains even greater. He says that, explains it slightly differently. He says if you have a pail, and the pail has nectar in it, or honey, and you empty that pail, what happens when you empty the pail? Because there is a residue of that honey, all types of insects and all kinds of rodents come and are attracted to that pail because of the residue of the nectar, and the quality of the nectar remains in the pail. What about if you have a pail filled with manure and you empty it? It will attract something similar, but not to the same degree, because it's a different level of quality what's in that pail. The body, the Jewish soul, which is the ultimate of nectar, so to say, the ultimate of Kedusha, and because he explains it like this: everything has to be sustained by God, even the nether force. So what is the source of its sustenance? Kedusha. So because it has that remnant of Kedusha, therefore it's like a leech, a parasite. It has to attach itself. It like sucks out that Kedusha which is in the body, because that sustains it, and that's why it's attracted to it. But on the other hand, if it doesn't have any Kedusha, the nether force don't gather with that level of intensity, therefore the damage is not to the same degree. So the korban, which is the ultimate, he says there's nothing more holy than the korban. When it becomes not permitted because it expires, the Kedusha leaves it, therefore the nether forces attach themselves. This is how he explains it.